Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel. Amir Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, the second line from the top, middle of the line, the word V'kesher. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasuna Bar Tzara U'Mashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayom U'Bein Bayabasha, Hamakayim Yerachem Alehem, V'Yitziim Mitzara L'Revacha Me'afela L'Oiro Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagolo V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema from a Shemer ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka Bashir Aleach, Havadasa Baserel, and Avraham ben Tzion ben Sarah Liba. They should have Refuah Shalema B'Sai Sharcha Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yerdison ben Michal and Yoel ben Michal. The Rabbeinu Shalom should watch over them together with all of our other brothers and sisters that find themselves in harm's way. B'chol Makayim Shehem. So we began yesterday learning Siman Shin Yud Zayin, the halachas of Keshira v'Aniva b'Shabbos, the halachas that govern the making of knots, the untying of knots, making various types of loops on Shabbos, etc., etc. And really, what we have to recap before we begin today's share, we have to remember the major machlokes rishonim that the Mishnah Berurah and really the Mechaber and the Ramah introduced us to yesterday. And that is the machlokes between the Shitas Harif v'Harambam, which is the Shita in the Rishonim that the Mechaber follows, and the Shita of Rashi and the Rush, which we are going to see halacha l'maisa. We need to follow the chumras, the stringencies, that come out from both of these shitas. So what exactly was this machlokes? The Chavetz Chaim, in his beautiful Hakdama to the Siman, told us from the Gemara that we really categorize the tying of knots into three different categories when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos. You have one category of knot, which if you tie such a knot, it is an Issa Daraisa. There's a second category that is not an Issa Daraisa of Kosher, but it is an Issa Darabanan. And then there is a third category, which is Mutter Legamri. It's completely permissible to tie such a knot. According to the Rif and the Rambam, the question of whether or not tying a knot is Osir, and if it's Osir Midaraisa or Osir Midarabanan, hinges on two factors. One factor is this knot a Maaseh Uman? Is this knot, so to speak, a professional knot? It's a knot that would be tied from a craftsman, or is it a Maaseh Hedyot? Or is it a common knot that any commoner would tie? That's one variable. The second variable is it a Kesher Shel Kayama? And in the world of the Rif and the Rambam and the Mechaber, a Kesher Shel Kayama, a permanent knot, means a bona fide Kesher Shel Kayama, a real permanent knot, a knot that is intended to remain in place la'olam. Darka lihiyos kach la'olam. It is the way of such a knot that it is tied to remain in place forever. And I'll just give one of the examples that the Mechaber gave us. The Mechaber gave us the case of a Kesher Hagamolim, the type of knot that a camel driver would tie. And that was, the camel driver pierces the nose of the camel, he takes a leather strap, he pushes it through the hole created by the piercing, and then he closes it, he ties it into a loop. That loop is intended to remain closed forever. And this is a knot that is being tied by a professional camel driver. They had a professional type of knot that they used. So this would be a Maaseh Uman, it's a professional knot, and it's also a bona fide Kesher Shel Kayama. It's Darka Lihiyos Kach La'olam. According to the Rif and the Rambam, and again, the Mechaber Paskins like the Rif and the Rambam, this would be a knot that would be an Issa Daraisa. Tying such a knot is Osir min HaTorah, because you ticked off both boxes. It's a Kesher Shel Kayama, and it's a Maaseh Uman. How about if you only get one of the variables? How about if you tie a knot that is a Kesher Shel Kayama, but it's not a Maaseh Uman? It's Darka Lihiyos Kach La'olam. It's intended to remain in place forever, but it's a commoner's knot. It's not a professional knot. That, the Mechaber told us yesterday, is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. Today we're going to see that the Mechaber is going to tell us that the opposite is also true. What if the knot that you're tying is a Maaseh Uman, it's a professional knot, but it's not a Kesher Shel Kayama? In that case, according to the Rif and the Rambam and the Mechaber, that would also be an Issa Midrabanan. So we have our Issa Daraisa, Arisa Daraisa is Kesher Shakayama, Maise Uman. We have 2 Isurei Darabanan. Kesher Shakayama, but not Maise Uman, or Maise Uman, but not Kesher Shakayama. And then we have the Nat that's Mutter Lagamri. The Nat that's Mutter Lagamri is something that's not a Kesher Shakayama. It's not Dark Eliyas Kachla Olam. It's not intended to remain in place forever. It might be intended to remain in place for a month, but it's not Dark Eliyas Kachla Olam. Since it's not Dark Eliyas Kachla Olam, it's not a Kesher Shakayama in the world of the Rif and the Rambam. And if that knot is also a Maise Hedyet, it's a commoner's knot, it's not a Maise Uman, such a knot, according to the Rif and the Rambam and the Mechaber, would be mutter legamri. It would be 100% mutter to tie such a knot, not an Issa Daraisa, not even an Issa Darabanan. So that is the Shita of the Rif and the Rambam, and really that's the Shita that we're going to need most for today's shir. But then we also saw the Shita of Rashi and the Rush. In Rashi and the Rush, they don't really pay attention to the question of whether or not a knot is a Maise Uman. They don't recognize that variable as making a difference. It doesn't matter if the knot is a Maise Uman or it's a Maise Hedyet. The whole question of how to categorize a knot and decide if it's an Issa Daraisa, an Issa Darabanan, or Mutter Lagamri, it all rides on the question of the permanence of the knot. How permanent is this knot? If it's a bona fide Kesher Shakayama, it's Dark Eliyas Kachla Olam, that's an Issa Daraisa. But what if it's not a bona fide Kesher Shakayama? What if it's a Kesher Shakayama Ktsas? It's made to be in place for Ktsas Zman. It's made to last for a while. According to Rashi and the Rush, that already is an Issa Darabanan. Even though it's not a real Kesher Shakayama, but it's doima le Kesher Shakayama. It's similar to a Kesher Shakayama because it is intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time. Now, we saw yesterday in the Ramah what constitutes a significant amount of time. We had a machlokes. There's one shita that says if the knot is intended to remain in place for more than 24 hours, that's already a Kesher Shakayama Ktsas, and that's already an Issa Darabanan. Then there's a more lenient shita, there's a more kuludika shita that says no. It has to be intended to remain in place for at least 7 days. If it's intended to remain in place for at least 7 days, that's a Kesher Shayama Ktsas that would be also b'darabanan. But what if this knot has no permanence whatsoever? What if this knot is a knot that you intend to untie on the very same day? Then, according to Rashi and the Rush, there is your knot that is mutter legamri. Knot that has no permanence whatsoever. You're going to untie it the very same day. Or according to the more kuludika opinion, you're going to untie it within 7 days. That is mutter legamri, no Issa Daraisa, no Issa Darabanan. So now, against that backdrop, let's go a little bit weiter in the Mechaber, Kuf Laman Aleph Amud Beis, second line down, the middle of the line. So yesterday in the Mechaber, we saw where the Mechaber said that any knot that is a Kesher Shel Kayama, and again, in the world of the Mechaber, that means a truly permanent knot, a knot that's Dark Eliyas Kachla Olam, but it's not a Maise Uman. On that, the Mechaber said potter, and we know potter means potter avaloser. You're exempt from being a carbon chatas if you tie it b'shoigeg, but it is an issa b'derabbanan. Now, says the Mechaber going weiter, v'kesher she'enoi shel kayama, if you have a knot that is not a kesher shel kayama, and again, in the world of the Mechaber, this means that it's not a truly permanent knot, it's not Dark Eliyas Kachla Olam, v'kesher she'enoi shel kayama ve'enoi maise uman, and let's say it's also not a maise uman, on that, says the Mechaber, mutter lekashrei lechatchila. That would be mamish mutter lechatchila. Such a knot, it's not a Kesher Shel Kayama, it's not a Maise Uman, you haven't checked off either one of the checkboxes, so that's the knot that, according to the Rif and the Rambam, is Mamish Mutter Legamri, Mutter Lekashrei Lechatchila. Says the Ramah Haggah, V'chein le'inyan HaTorah. Also, when it comes to the shaila of opening such a knot, untying such a knot, dinoi k'moy le'inyan kishirasai, the halacha of untying a knot on each category follows the same halacha as the halacha of tying a knot in such a category. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Zayin Dina Kamay Ritzayin Loymar. What the Mechaber wants to say is the Imhu Keshesh Chayav Al Kishurai. If there's a knot which would be an Issa Daraisa, Chayiv means an Issa Daraisa. If it's a knot that would be an Issa Daraisa to tie, Chayav Al Heterai. It would also be Aser, you would be Chayiv if you untied it. V'chol shehu Pater Aval Aser, any knot that would fall into the category of an Issa Darabanan to tie, Oy Mutter L'chatchila, or any knot that would fall into the category of a knot that's 100% mutter to tie, Gam Beheterai Kainhu. The same rules would apply to the untying of such a knot, and he brings this down from the Rambam. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says an interesting halacha, and there's really a lot that lies between the lines of the next three lines, beyond the scope really of what we do, so we'll explain it from 30,000 feet. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'chol kesher shemuter lahatiroi, any knot that you are allowed to untie. So, that would mean, in the world of the Mechaber, you have a knot that's not a Kesher Shakayama, and it's not a Maaseh Uman, so you're allowed to tie such a knot. Since you're allowed to tie it, you're allowed to untie it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'chol Kesher Shemuter Lahatiroi, any knot that you are allowed to untie, Im Eino Yochel Lahatiroi, if for whatever reason you're unable to untie it. Now, in your mind, that sounds a little bit counterintuitive. If this is a knot that you're allowed to tie, how is it such a tight knot that you can't untie it? Well, that's not such a kasha. Because remember, we're going now in the Mechaber. So we're going with the sheet of the Rif and the Rambam. So we're talking about a knot that's not a bona fide kesher shakayama. When it was tied, it was not intended to remain in place forever. So it's not a kesher shakayama. It's also not a maaseh uman. It's not a highly specialized craftsman's knot. It's not a professional knot. It's a knot that you tied. It's a simple knot. But you tied it very tightly, and therefore you're having difficulty untying it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, since that's a knot that, according to the Mechaber, you are allowed to untie, problem is that you can't untie it, mutter lenatkoi, you're allowed to rip it open. So you're allowed to break the chut, you're allowed to break the rope or break the lace, whatever it is that you wanted to untie. You can't untie the knot, you could snap it open, you could tear it open. Mutter lenatkoi imhu litzayrich. If there's a tzayrich. So one of the examples that the Mefarshim give is you're wearing a beged, you're wearing some kind of a shirt or something that has a closure that ties closed. And it's a knot that you're allowed to tie. It's not a kesher shakayama. You put it on when you put on the beged, you're intending on taking the beged off, so it's certainly not a kesher shakayama. It's also not a knot that's a maaseh uman, at least in the world of the Mechaber. It's not a maaseh uman, it's a commoner's knot that you tied. But now, for some reason, you can't untie it, you're allowed to rip it open l'tzayrich. Well, taking off your shirt is definitely a tzayrich. You want to go to sleep. So it's definitely a tzayrich to take it off. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you'd be allowed to snap it open. But, cautions the Mishnah Berurah, ve'ein lasis kain b'ftei am ha'aretz, you should not do this in front of an am ha'aretz. You shouldn't do it in front of somebody who has no background in halacha and in learning. Why? Because when you do something like that in front of an am ha'aretz, the am ha'aretz didn't learn Siman Shin Yod Zayin. He doesn't know the intricacies of all of the shilas of kosher and matir, tying and untying, and he doesn't know the intricacies of the halacha of kaireya, the halacha of ripping. And now you're going and you're ripping open a strap. So he might learn from there to be makel. So you can't do this in front of an am ha'aretz. Now, the question over here is, the Mishnah Berurah says that you're allowed to rip this open. The question becomes, why taka? Why isn't there an issue of kaireya? Why isn't there a problem of ripping the strap or whatever it is that you wanted to untie that you can't untie? So there are various explanations. One is that over here, you're not tearing something to a specific measurement, so that already takes away a lot of the shaila of kaireya. Also, you're not tearing something, not really the issa d'oraisa of kaireya is tearing something in order to re-sew it. So the classic example of the Gemara in Shabbos is sometimes you have a garment that has a damage on it, and in order to do a neat repair, what you do is you rip where the damage is, you rip out a piece of fabric, so that you create a nice area, a nice clean area to create a seam. That is kareya al minas litvar. You're tearing in order to re-sew. That's really the Issa Daraisa. Now, there's an Issa Darabanan of kareya even when it's not al minas litvar. But, say the Mefarshim over here, where you're talking about a strap or a lace that has a knot in it, and you want to rip it open because you can't untie the knot, there's really no shaila at all of karei almanas litvar, because this is not something that you're going to sew together. Imagine a shoelace that you can't untie, and now you rip it apart. No one is stitching the two ends of a shoelace together. So even though karei shaloi almanas litvar can be an issa d'Rabbanan, over here, it's only an issa d'Rabbanan because we're going to asim d'Rabbanan karei shaloi almanas litvar, Otu karei almanas litvar. But by the type of strap that we're talking about, there is no shaykhis, there's no similarity to karei almanas litvar. We're not going to aser karei shaloi almanas litvar, otu karei almanas litvar, because there is no karei almanas litvar when it comes to something like a shoelace. Okay. Now let's go back into the Mechaber, third line down, about 2/3 of the way through the line, after the words of the Ramah that we just read. Says the Mechaber, Ketzad. What is the case? Now, what's the Ketzad that the Mechaber is talking about over here? He's going back on what we learned yesterday. The Mechaber said yesterday that when you have a Kesher Shel Kayama, and again, remember, Mechaber, when you have a Kesher Shel Kayama, which means Darka Liyois Kach La'olam, a real bona fide Kesher Shel Kayama. The Mechaber said yesterday, if you have a Kesher Shel Kayama, but it's not a Maaseh Uman, it's not a professional knot, that is an Issa D'Rabbanan, right? Mechaber, Rif, Rambam. It's a Kesher Shel Kayama, but it's not a Maaseh Uman, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan. On that, says the Mechaber Ketzad. What is such a case where you have a Kesher Shel Kayama, but it's not a Maaseh Uman? Says the Mechaber, I'll tell you we have such a case. Nifsikaloi ritzua. Let's say the strap of your shoe. So this is the strap that I described yesterday. You have the sole of the shoe. A strap goes through the hole on the sole. You tie a knot underneath so that the strap cannot come back out through the hole. And this is the strap. It's affixed to both sides of the sole of the shoe. And the strap goes over the top of your foot. Let's say the strap ripped, and now you want to tie the strap together so that you could wear the shoe. Now, when you tie that strap, it's not temporary. You want that strap to remain closed. When the shoe was in its proper condition, this strap is supposed to remain closed. It's a loop, right? There's a hole on each side of the sole of the shoe. The strap goes through on both sides. There's a knot tied on both ends to keep this loop closed. Now, the loop ripped open. You're repairing it by tying a knot. That knot is darka liyas kach la'olam. You want that knot to remain closed for the life of the shoe. You're not interested in it opening and you having to tie it again. So this is a kesher shel kayama. So nifsikaloi ritzua, if the strap of your shoe rips, ukeshara, and you tie it, what you're doing is, you're tying a kesher shel kayama, you're tying a knot that's darka liyas kach la'olam, but it's not a maaseh uman. You're not a cobbler. You don't know how to tie a cobbler's knot. You're tying a commoner's knot. So this is a perfect case of what the Mechaber said yesterday. Kesher shel kayama, not a maaseh uman. This would be an issa d'Rabbanan. Another case, nifsa kachevel. You have a rope. Maybe it's a rope that you use to draw a bucket up out of the well. You have a rope, and the rope ripped. So you had a 30-foot rope, and now it ripped at the 15-foot mark. You don't need a 15-foot rope. You need a 30-foot rope. So what do you want to do? You want to tie the two ends of the rope together. Nifsak achevel, if a rope ripped, ukesharai, and you tie it. Here we go again. It's a kesher shel kayama. You want this knot that you're tying the two ends of the rope together, you want it to remain in place forever. So it's a kesher shel kayama, but it's not a maaseh uman, it's a maaseh idiot. You're a commoner. You don't tie professional knots. Oi, shekosha chevel bidli. Or you have a bucket that you use to draw water up out of the well. Are you interested in retying this every week? No. When you tie the rope to the dli, when you tie it to the bucket, you want it to remain in place. You don't want to have to retie it. So when you tie that knot, it's darka liyas kach la'olam. But again, you're not an uman. You're a commoner. You're a balabas. So this is a maaseh hedyot. It's not a maaseh uman. Another case, shekesher resen behema, or you tie the rein of an animal. Now, according to the Mishnah Berurah, what this means is, this is the case that we described yesterday when we spoke about the kesher hagamolim. So this is, what you're doing is the camel, or whatever animal you're dealing with, has a pierced nose, and now you want to take a strap, push it through the hole, and tie it closed, and you want that to be the rein for the animal. You don't intend on untying it. You want it to remain in place forever. But you are not a professional camel driver, or a camel raiser, or a camel merchant. So you don't tie the maaseh uman. You don't know the camel driver is not. You're just a pashut farmer who happens to have a pickup truck camel. So you're going to go tie on a rein, but you're going to use a maaseh hedyot. But it's darkly as kach la'olam. You intend for it to remain in place forever. So again, this is a kesher shakayama, but it is not a maaseh uman. Says the Mechaber, in all of these cases, harei ze potter. These would all be cases that are potter. If you did it b'shoigeg, you would be potter for bringing a carbon chatas, but it's potter aval aser. It's aser midrabanan. V'chein kol kiyotze be'elu hakesharim. Any other knots that are similar to these aforementioned knots, shehei maaseh hedyot, all of these knots are a maaseh hedyot, the commoner's knots, they're not professional knots. V'chol adam kosher oisam lekayama. However, they are being tied to be a kesher shakayama. You're tying them to be a kesher shakayama. You want it to be a permanent knot. So all of these are an iser derabanan. Now, once we had these lines of the Mechaber, beginning with the word ketzad, right by the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan ches, and ending right over here, v'chol adam kosher oisam lekayama, here we have the two isurei derabanan. We've now listed, according to the Mechaber, both isurei derabanan. In yesterday's shir, we spoke about on Amud Aleph, hakosher kesher shakayama ve'ena maaseh uman. Right? If you, well, no, actually, we only have one so far, right? We have over here kesher shakayama ve'ena maaseh uman. That's all the cases that we just discussed now. I'm sorry, we don't have both. We have one so far. These are all the kesher shakayamas that are not a maaseh uman, and that is an iser derabanan. Let's pause over here for a second, and let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah katan ches, ketzad, nifsika, explains the Mishnah Berurah de la'el koi. This entry of the Mechaber, this ketzad, what is the case, is going back on what we learned yesterday. B'shal kayama v'ena maaseh uman. We're discussing knots that are kesher shakayama. They're bona fide permanent knots that are darkaliyas kach la'olam, but they're not a maaseh uman. And what's the halacha by those the Mechaber said yesterday? The potter aval oser. Ois katan tes, one case was the chevel b'dli, the rope that you're tying onto a bucket. Hatoli sham al pia be'er. This is the bucket that remains at the opening of the well, lishoiv by mayim, that is used to draw the water. That is a knot that you're tying, you want it to remain there. So this is a kesher shakayama, but it's not a maaseh uman. Okay, going back to the Mechaber, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down, near about 2/3 of the way through the line. V'chol kesher she'enoi shel kayama. How about if you tie a knot that's not a kesher shel kayama, even if it's not a kesher shel kayama at all? The Mishnah Berurah is going to say that in ois katan yud. V'chol kesher she'enoi shel kayama. Any knot that has no permanence whatsoever. Let's say it's a knot that you mamish intend on opening an hour from now. So it's really not a kesher shel kayama. V'chol kesher she'enoi shel kayama. Any knot that is not, no pun intended, a kesher shel kayama, im kishare kesher uman. But if it's a craftsman's knot, see, this is the second iser derabanan, according to the Mechaber. So you have a knot that's not a kesher shakayama at all. It has no permanence. But im kishare kesher uman, if it's a professional knot, harei ze aser. That's also an iser derabanan, right? Rambam, Rif, Mechaber. If you tick off only one of the boxes, if it's a kesher shakayama, but it's not a maaseh uman, also Darabanan. But if it's a Maisa Uman and not a Kesher Shakayama, that's also an Issa Darabanan. Hareza Aser, this would be an Issa Darabanan. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kat Yod She'ein Shakayama, and this is what I just told you now, says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu afilu b'sha'asoi lahatir ba'oisa yoim atzmoi. Even if this knot has no permanence whatsoever, you intend on untying it an hour from now. So it's completely not a Kesher Shakayama. Also, l'deyazu, according to the Mechaber, according to the Rif and the Rambam, this is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Kevin she'aso Maaseh Uman, since it is a Maaseh Uman. So at this point in the Mechaber, we have covered the Issa D'Oraisa. That's a knot, that's a Kesher Shakayama and a Maaseh Uman. We've covered both Isurei D'Rabbanan. A knot that's a Kesher Shakayama, but it's a Maaseh Hedyot. And now we've just covered a knot that's a Maaseh Uman, but is not at all a Kesher Shakayama. So you have all three categories. Now the Mechaber gives us an interesting heter. The Mechaber says, what if you have, the Mechaber just told us that a Kesher that's not a Kesher Shakayama, but it's a Maaseh Uman, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan. On that, says the Mechaber, an interesting heter. Ulitzorich mitzvah. Let's say you want to tie a knot that's a Kesher, it's a Maaseh Uman, but it's not a Kesher Shakayama. But you want to do it for a Tzorich mitzvah. Ulitzorich mitzvah. Keep going, for example. Shekosher limdoid echad mishiurei HaTorah. Let's say you need to tie a rope. You have two sections of rope, and you want to tie them together in order to create a longer rope. And why are you doing it? You're doing it to measure something, but not stam you're measuring your living room. You want to measure a mikveh. So you want to know if a mikveh is big enough. Is it arba misah? Is it a kosher mikveh? And the way you're going to calculate it is, you're going to measure the depth of the mikveh, you're going to measure the length of the mikveh, you're going to measure the width of the mikveh, you're going to do your calculation, you're going to figure out how much water it holds. Now, they didn't have tape measures. They used ropes. But you don't have a rope that's long enough. So you tie two sections of the rope together. And let's say you happen to be a sailor, or you happen to be a camel driver. So you know how to tie professional knots. So you're going to tie a Maaseh Uman, but it's not going to be a Kesher Shakayama. You're not doing this in order to create a permanent measuring tape. You just need something right now. A half hour from now, I'll untie it. Well, in the world of the Rif and the Rambam and the Mechaber, that would be an Issa D'Rabbanan, right? Because it's a Maaseh Uman, but it's not a Kesher Shakayama. So you checked off one of the boxes. This is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Says the Mechaber, since you're doing it l'tzarich mitzvah, or l'tzarich mitzvah, kigon shekosher limdoid echad mishiyurei HaTorah, mutter likshar kesher she'ein shakayama, you're allowed to go ahead and tie a kesher that's not a kesher shakayama, even if it's a Maaseh Uman. So it's a Maaseh Uman, but it's not a Kesher Shakayama. It should be an Issa D'Rabbanan. L'tzarich mitzvah, we're going to be matir it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kat Yod Aleph, shekosher limdoid, hainu shekosher shtei chavalim b'yachad. You're taking two ropes and tying them together to create a longer rope, k'dei sheyuchal limdoid behem shir mikvah, so that you could go ahead and you could measure the size of a mikvah to know if it is a kosher mikvah or not. Ois Kat Yod Beis, mutter likshar. It's mutter to do this. Hainu afilu hu Maaseh Uman. The point of this heter of the Mechaber is that you're allowed to do this even though you're going to use a Maaseh Uman knot. You see, if you read the Mechaber carefully, the Mechaber never gave us that critical piece of information. The Mechaber told us over here, L'tzorich mitzvah mutter likshar kesher she'ein shakayama. L'tzorich mitzvah, you're allowed to tie a kesher she'ein shakayama. Well, if it's also not a Maaseh Uman, so of course you're allowed to do it. You didn't check off either one of the boxes. According to the Mechaber, that's the knot that's mutter legamri. So there's no chiddush. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, no, what the Mechaber means to say is, yes, it's a kesher she'ein shakayama, but it's a Maaseh Uman. So it should be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Over here, we're going to be matir it. And explains the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go back to his Kat Yud Beis. Hainu afilu hu Maaseh Uman. Di'ilavachi. Because if it's not a Maaseh Uman, and it's also not a Kesher Shakayama, so then I feel a below mitzvah shari. Then we don't have to come out to a heter of a tzarich mitzvah, right? Because that, according to the Mechaber, would be mutter legamri. Umayri, and now the Mishnah Berurah says, but this heter, be careful with this heter. Umayri kishi'iev shabinyan acher. This is not a blanket heter. Sure, go ahead. Use a professional knot. Use a Maaseh Uman. As long as it's not a kesher shakayama, will be matter this is the rabbanon l'tzarich mitzvah. Says the Mishnah Berurah. No, ma'ir kishi efshe binyan acher. This is only true if you have no other way to accomplish what you need to accomplish l'tzarich mitzvah. The lavachi, because if you could do it another way, yaseu ma'aseh hedyet. So don't use a professional knot. Use a common knot, or yaniva lavad, or use a slip knot. V'yimdoid boy. V'lo yitztark lahatir isid rabbanon. We're not going to be matir isid rabbanon just klacher yad. Just turn around and say, oh, it's tzarich mitzvah. We're going to be matir isid rabbanon. No, it has to be that you have no choice. Why do you have no choice? I don't know. Maybe the type of rope that you're using, the two pieces of rope aren't going to hold together unless you use a Maaseh Uman. So you need to use a Maaseh Uman. All right? You have no choice. You need to use a Maaseh Uman. But it's not a kesher shakayama, so it should be an issa d'rabbanon. We could be matir it l'tzarich mitzvah. Ice cutting your gimel she'ena shel kayama. You're tying a knot that's not a kesher shakayama. Hainu afilu hu asi lizman. Even if you're gonna leave it in place for a little while, maybe you'll leave it in place for 2 days. Maybe you'll leave it in place for 7 days. Doesn't matter, because remember, the mechaber follows the Rambam. According to the Rif and the Rambam, there are only two. There's a kesher shakayama. A kesher shakayama means daikali is kach la'olam, a permanent, forever knot. That's a kesher shakayama. Anything less than that, in the world of the Rif and the Rambam, is a kesher she'ena shakayama, is a non-permanent knot. The Rambam and the Rif do not recognize a middle ground. Rashi and the Rush recognize a middle ground. According to Rashi and the Rush, there's a forever knot. That's a mamash kesher shakayama. That's it is a daraisa. Then there's like a semi-permanent knot. There's a knot that's for more than a day, for more than 7 days. That's an issa d'rabbanan. So according to Rashi and the Rush, there's such a thing as a semi-permanent knot. That's a problematic knot. But in the world with the Rif and the Rambam, there's no such thing. If it's a knot that's meant to stay in place for a month, but it's not a forever knot, it's not a kesher shakayama. So if it's not a kesher shakayama, and it is a Maaseh Uman, it should be an issa d'rabbanan. We're matir it l'tzarich mitzvah. And you can see this spoken out, by the way, in the Sharit Tzion Ois Katan Vav. Kosav the Sefer Beis Meir. In the Sefer Beis Meir, he brings down an interesting opinion. Shema shehetek hashulchan aruch the mutter b'makom mitzvah. This heter, to tie this knot that should be an issa d'rabbanan b'makom mitzvah, hu rak das harambam v'haTorah. This is true according to the Rambam and the Torah. Aval Rashi v'hatoisvis u'bartanur sham mitzadei dekesher aser afilu b'makom mitzvah ayin sham. The Beis Meir says, do not take what the Mishnah Berurah just said and apply it to Shitas Rashi. You can't take what we just saw in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Gimel and say to ourselves, oh, okay, the Mishnah Berurah just told me any knot that's only an issa d'rabbanan is mutter when it's tzarchei mitzvah. No. According to the Rambam, in this specific case, you have a knot that's a Maaseh Uman, but it's not a kesher shakayama. When matter that l'tzarchei mitzvah, we cannot just blanket extend that to any other knot that is an isser d'rabbanan. Okay, that brings us to the Ramah. Now, this Ramah is a very, very critical Ramah in the world of halacha l'maisa. Says the Ramah, Haga. V'yesh aimrim, there are those that say, T'yesh li zaher, that we have to take care, shaloi lahatir shum kesher, that we do not untie any knot, shehu shnei kesharim zeh al zeh. Any double knot. Anytime you have one knot, and then a second knot tied on top of the first knot, you should never untie a double knot. Okay? Why not? No pun intended. Says the Ramah, De'ein anu b'kiyim eze mikri kesher shel uman. Because we don't have a true understanding of the meaning of Maaseh Uman. We don't know exactly what this means, a professional knot as opposed to a commoner's knot. We don't have, there's no, in the Shulchan Aruch over here, he doesn't give us pictures and diagrams. This is a Maaseh Uman, this is a Maaseh Hedyot. We don't have a true understanding of what's a Maaseh Uman and what's a Maaseh Hedyot. Now, when you have a double knot, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah right away. The Mishnah Berurah says in Ois Katan Yud Daled, T'yesh li zoher. You should take care, says the Ramah, never to untie a double knot. You have two knots, one on top of the other, Do not untie it on Shabbos. Why? Says the Mishnah Berurah Pirush. Kevin the Lirif Varambam also lechatchila beuman afilu kishemater boy b'yoyim. Let's do the math. According to the Rif and the Rambam, if you have a knot that is a maaseh uman, if you have a professional knot, then it doesn't have to be a kesher shakayama at all in order for it to be usher to tie it or to untie it. Once you have a knot that's a maaseh uman, you have already checked off one of the two critical boxes. It's a maaseh uman. So now I don't care if that knot was tied with the intent that it should be untied an hour from now. It is a maaseh uman. Once it's a maaseh uman, it's an issa d'rabbanan to tie that knot, and like we learned at the beginning of today's shir, it's also an issa d'rabbanan to untie that knot. So if we look at a knot on Shabbos afternoon, and we want to know, are we allowed to untie it or are we not allowed to untie it? Well, question number one is going to be, is that knot a maaseh uman? If it's a maaseh uman, then according to the Rif and the Rambam, you're not allowed to untie it. I don't have to know how long it was intended to last for. It's not negeya. One of the two boxes was checked off. It's a maaseh uman. Since it's a maaseh uman, it's an issa d'rabbanan to tie it. Since it's an issa d'rabbanan to tie it, it's an issa d'rabbanan to untie it. So says the Ramah, because of that, if you see a double knot, one on top of the other, you can't untie it on Shabbos. Why? Because we don't know what's called a professional knot. And when we see a double knot, one knot on top of the other, we have to be concerned that that might constitute a professional knot. That might constitute a maaseh uman, and therefore it would be an issa d'rabbanan to untie it. Let's see it in the Mishnah Berurah. Pirush. Kevin the Rif Rambam. Also lechatchila. It's an issa d'rabbanan beuman, by a knot that's a maaseh uman, a professional knot. Afilu kishamater boy b'yoyim, even if it's being untied the very same day. Ve'einanu b'kiyin mashu mahu kesher shel uman, and we don't really know what constitutes a knot that's a professional knot. Umistabra, and says the Chavetz Chaim, it makes sense. Now, the Chavetz Chaim uses the words "it makes sense." He's bringing this down from the Magen Avraham and the Shiltei Giborim. It's not the Chavetz Chaim saying mistabra. It makes sense. He's bringing, this is the lashon of the Shiltei Giborim, ultimately. Mistabra, it makes sense. The chol kesher shekoishrin oisai hadek heitev. Any well-tied, tight knot, hevish aluman. It makes sense to say that that's a professional knot. What's the point of a professional knot versus a commoner's knot? Obviously, a professional knot is a higher quality knot. What does that mean? What makes a knot a higher quality knot? It's tight. It stays in place better. So, says the Shiltei Giborim, when you see a knot that's a very tight, firm knot, it makes sense that might be a kesher shaluman. That might be a maaseh uman. Lekach, therefore, anu nizharim b'chol kesher shu shnei shel shnei ksharim. We have to be careful. Anytime we are faced with a double knot, the shnei ksharim have a kesher amitz, because a double knot is a strong knot. So we have to worry that it might be a kesher shel uman, it might be a maaseh uman, and it might be an issa d'rabbanan. We have to be chayshish for the opinion of the Rif and the Rambam that if it's a maaseh uman, even if it has no permanence, it's an issa d'rabbanan to tie it, and likewise an issa d'rabbanan to untie it. Umashakos shum kesher, and when the Ramah uses these words, the yesh lizar shel alahater shum kesher, any kesher, that's a double knot. Ritzon alarme means to say, afilu oisam kisharin hamuvuarin lekaban b'sim zeh the mutter likshar lahater hainu dafka b'kesher echad. What he means is later on in the Siman, we're going to see in the Shulchan Aruch types of knots that are mutter. But the Ramah means to say, even those knots, if there's one on top of the other, if they're doubled, you can't untie it on Shabbos, because we have to be chayshish for the shita of the Rif and the Rambam, and we have to be chayshish that this might be a kesher shel uman, and therefore it would be an issa d'rabbanan to untie it. Let's go back into the Ramah, because we didn't finish the words of the Ramah. I'm going to read again from the beginning of the Ramah. Hagah. The Yesh, I remember there are those that say the Yesh Lizar that we must take care Shaloi Lahati Shum Kesher Shu Shteik Sharm Zalzeh, that we should never untie a double knot, one knot untied on top of another. Why? The Einanu B'Kiyam Eze Mikvi Kesher Shaluman, because we are not clear on what constitutes a Maisei Uman, what constitutes a professional knot, and we have to be concerned that since a double knot is a very tight, firm knot, that might be called a Maisei Uman. And according to the Rif and the Rambam and the Mechaber, such a knot, even if it has no permanence whatsoever, is an Issa D'Rabbanan to tie it, and therefore it's also an Issa D'Rabbanan to untie it. And that's the way we are noyeg, never to untie such a knot. Nevertheless, near it would seem to be makom tzara, if we have a knot that's causing tsar. So like I said earlier, if you have such a knot that's tying your clothing on or tying your shoe on, and now you got to get it off to go to sleep Friday night, ein lachush, you don't have to worry for this chumrah or mutar la'atirai, and you would be allowed to untie it. Because again, this is a chumrah. What we're doing is we're doing the math, and we're saying, well, according to the Rif of the Rambam, a Maisei Uman that's not a Kesher Shakayama is an Isser Rabbanon. Double knot is very tight. It might constitute a Maisei Uman. Therefore, we're going to be machmer, and we're going to say not to untie it. But if it's causing tsar, we don't have to be choshish. De'enei eli Isser Rabbanon u'v'makom tsar lo gazru. V'hod be'inan shnei ksharim zalzeh. When is it true that this chumrah only kicks in when it's one knot on top of another? That's when you're tying two strands together. But if you have one single strand, let's say a string of tzitzis, okay? So if you have a single strand and you go and you tie a knot in itself, so I'm making a knot just on one strand, then says the Ramah, when you take one strand and you tie a knot, in order for that knot to remain firmly in place, you don't have to have one knot on top of another. One single knot alone will stay very firmly, and therefore, even in that case, says the Ramah, we would extend this chumrah and say that it should not be untied on Shabbos, lest it constitute a Maisei Uman, and lest it be an Issa D'Rabbanan, according to the Shita of the Rif and the Rambam. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Tezvav Dina Kishnei Kisharim, does Mishadik Shaper, because such a knot ties very firmly, and it stays tight, or Mikri Kesher Shel Uman, and therefore it would possibly be called a Maisei Uman. Okay, we're going to pause over here. We'll continue next time here at Hashem with Sif Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Ram Shem should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the B'yaz Kol Tzedek. V'mheri v'yameinu amen. Be well.